So the great thing about ThreatTraq is that we can talk about things on a weekly basis, and it's very timely to what's going on in the real world. So for example, we spoke today about the WebEx vulnerability that was just recently discovered. So Manny, I hear you have a story about a new WebEx vulnerability?
Yeah, so this is one that just popped up, and it seemed pretty critical. Whenever you're talking about something having to do with WebEx, it's always something that people pay attention to. So I thought this would be a good one to kind of talk through. So this is another one that has been found by one of our favorite reporters, Travis Ormandy, from the Google Project Zero. And he also worked with a guy, Chris Necker of Divergent Security. He found a vulnerability in Cisco's WebEx extension as part of the Chrome and Firefox browsers. The big danger with this one is its remote code execution ability. If they can trick the user into visiting a website and they are running this vulnerable extension, a browser extension, in essence, they get full control over pretty much everything on the operating system. He reported it to Cisco back on July 6th of this year, and Cisco quickly turned it around. I think within less than a week, turned it around and produced an update to the extension. WebEx, as we probably all know, is pretty well used application, right? So the numbers that I saw here were that there's something like 20 million users of WebEx, the WebEx extension, from just the Chrome browser. It's affecting quite a bit of folks. It affects about 20 million users of this extension, which today is used widely in video and conferencing applications.
The pool of people this impacts is pretty big, and probably the majority of those people are not really aware that they need to update and patch these types of extensions and things like that. They probably assume that their IT is going to handle it, and that may be the case, and that may not be the case. I think the problem is that WebEx is used by, in corporations for communications to every level of the company, in most companies, and I think there's going to be a varying level of individuals at all of these companies that are, they're able to update, and people that probably don't even consider updating. So I think that's where the real danger is the people that don't even think that or even understand that they need to update these extensions.
Right, and that's the key. That's going to be the key here, is to actually update the actual extension. There has been no evidence so far, that's as of today, that this has actually been exploited in the wild. But as we all know, now that it's sort of public knowledge, you can guarantee that there's going to be some folks that are going to start looking at trying to do this, especially since it's basically drive-by, right? So if you have so many users that are actually using this, it's a pretty soft target of a large target of folks that you can go after on this.
So I think we're all probably fortunate that one of the good guys found this vulnerability and not one of the bad guys.
Yeah. Absolutely. I mean, it's always better that you find this out as somebody was responsibly disclosing something like this, as opposed to finding it as a 0 day out there. But again, it still also depends on how quickly your path is to updating and patching these things.
Yeah, I think that's always the key, is making sure your machines are updated and patched properly, because there's always someone out there that's going to be able to take advantage of unpatched systems.
Yeah, and if anybody wants to read some of the details, there's obviously some details. Travis obviously wrote out some of the details about how he went about, why he started to look in this space, and some technical details about the actual vulnerability itself, which goes into some of the, I think it was actually some JavaScript and some sanitation functions that he found that were vulnerable, that were faulty.
Fortunately for this situation, one of the good guys actually found this vulnerability, and it wasn't one of the bad guys. And it's just a matter of time before someone actually takes advantage of this vulnerability and uses it for bad purposes. So it's the window of time to do what you need to do is very limited, and it's important to do what you need to do as always. I would consider it as a part of your job to make sure that you're protected, because you're protecting your company. There's a lot of things that go along with that.
So hey, Manish, I heard you have a story you were reading up on some new malware, something called LockPOS.
That's right. Arbor Networks recently discovered a new point-of-sale malware, and they named it LockPOS. So LockPOS is very similar to a lot of the existing point-of-sale malware. It's pretty stable. It doesn't do anything crazy, but it scrapes the RAM for credit card data.
Right.
It does a lot of the typical things that most point-of-sale malware does.
So in essence, it's stealing credit card information from your end POS device. POS standing for point of sale.
What's interesting about it is it's distributed via the FlockyBot botnet, and it shares the same command and control server as FlockyBot. So it's Arbor. They think that maybe the same actor that created and distributed FlockyBot is also now responsible for the LockPOS malware. One of the things is FlockyBot really targeted Brazil, which was kind of surprising to me. And and Arbor thinks that the same thing is going to happen with LockPOS. They're going to heavily target Brazil, and I was curious as to why Brazil. So I started looking into it, and apparently Brazil is, like, as far as cybercrime goes, they're like the number 2 country where for their rate of cybercrime.
Okay.
And doing a little more research, it seems that it's a combination of there's law enforcement response to cybercrime is very limited.
Okay.
And I think the lead up to the Olympics out in Brazil had also impacted that. And it seems like there's a lot of varying degrees of cybercrime going on there. There's all related to the criminal aspect and for monetary gain, basically. The reason I'm concerned with point-of-sale malware is because it really impacts those that are the most vulnerable. So you have these small businesses that, whether you're a retailer or a restaurant. Let's take a restaurant, for example. You go through your day, you want to make sure that you're providing good service to your customers, you're providing good food to your customers and things like that. That's the main thing that is of your concern. It's a situation where they now have to become experts in cybersecurity, and I think that's not going to happen. They don't have an IT budget, they don't have a cybersecurity budget. Chances of them being able to defend themselves and protect themselves are very slim. My concern is that a lot of these smaller retailers and restaurants, they don't have anyone working their their security systems and things like that, and
right.
it's probably up to the general manager or the store owner to kind of handle these things, and they're probably not well versed in cybersecurity at all. And I think that's where it's a huge problem especially when it comes to something like this.
Right.
And I was kind of surprised because in Brazil they use the chip and pin. And here we're starting to heavily use the chip and signature and some chip and pin, but mostly chip and signature.
Right,
but
yeah.
There's still a lot of retailers and even larger retailers, not even the smaller ones, that haven't upgraded their point of sale systems for varying reasons. It's whether it's the monetary cost of upgrading the
right.
systems, or I'm not really sure why they haven't. But there's I'm surprised at the amount of retailers that I visit that
right.
still ask you to swipe.
Were there numbers associated with how much they're actually seeing of this down there? I mean, and has it spread out from Brazil?
No, there was no real numbers from the report that I read from Arbor. It just seems to be something that just recently they discovered, so they're probably gathering those statistics right now.
Okay.
But one of the things I found interesting is I guess Arbor named it from the command and control. It operates over HTTP, and the user agent is Lock. So that's probably how they got the name LockPOS.
LockPOS, okay. So it's probably a good one to just start keeping an eye on,
right.
just to make sure that
right. It doesn't spread for outside of Brazil, and
right.
Because it's like I said, it's from what Arbor reported, it's a stable piece of malware. So, and it's spread by a botnet, FlockyBot. So the potential for it to move further out from Brazil is pretty good.
Right.
Part of that is, the actors that are distributing this malware, in the first place. Mm-hmm. Do they want to contain it to Brazil because they have a handle on Brazil, and there might be from the area, and they're able to know what to do with the credit card data and where to sell it and things like that, or do they not want maybe international law enforcement maybe now going after them and things like that.
True.
So it really, it's very dependent on the actors themselves.
The possibilities of something like this spreading outside of Brazil is a factor that you always have to pay attention to, because you've got either other actors who decide, hey, look, that's a good piece of malware, I'm going to go try to use this and bring it over to somewhere else, or we don't know yet whether or not it's just in its early stages and all they've done is just targeted Brazil, but their next target is to move outside of Brazil. So we always have to be cautious and mindful that some of this type of malware could, spread out from outside of the originating country. I wonder if, understanding the malware better, I don't, but I wonder what the potential is if it does somehow migrate into the US, what our risk is here. So based on the type of equipment that's normally used here, perhaps in some of the larger retailers. Now, again, we still have some of those problems here in the US with the smaller retailers who are still struggling with older POS systems, and they still may be vulnerable to that kind of stuff. But I'm wondering if, for the masses, is that still going to be a problem if it does show up here?
Sure, I feel probably what you're saying is correct. For the masses, it's probably an issue, and I think the larger retailers, they've become better at defending against these things. They're not great at it because we still, hear about point of sale malware affecting these larger retailers all the time. But I think for some of the larger retailers, they've become targeted by more sophisticated actors, criminal actors. Yeah. Whereas the less sophisticated criminal actors can heavily target the smaller retailers and restaurants and things like that. Yeah. And I think they're the ones that are going to be impacted by this one.
So from a small retailer perspective, probably trying to, as best as you can, keeping your POS systems completely isolated from anything else that you have connected to the internet. Right. Is probably the
best option. Move. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. Okay.
Hey guys, I thought I'd join you for the internet weather segment this week, and there's nothing really surprising as opposed to previous weeks, but there are a couple of infections that kind of manifested their way up into the top 10. So we're going to take a closer look at a few of those. This is the most probed ports. So these are the ports that are probed by volume, not necessarily by the number of sources. I like the ones by sources because it usually shows you botnet activity or devices doing things in mass. So this can kind of get a little skewed by one actor doing a lot of activity on a particular port. But in any event, the trend is basically true. You've got Telnet, SSH, you got your web, you got your Microsoft SQL Server on 1433 TCP, SMB, file sharing, 445 TCP. Some of these will show up again over on the sources one as well. But let's take a look at the most sources probing, because these are generally more interesting. The real interesting thing, in my opinion here, is if we were to take a look at this chart probably 6 months ago, this 23 TCP slice in red would have been about 75% of the pie chart. Yep. It's actually come down quite a bit as opposed to what it previously was. That's Telnet. Most of that is Internet of Things devices that get compromised with Mirai, Anyman or Perseri, which we're going to talk about as well. There's a lot of these embedded IoT families of malware that all vie for these same devices, and they keep taking them over. But they all scan for Telnet, and they're trying to brute force the password on the device, get in, install their malware, and then they take it over and use it. 445 TCP is at the number 2 position, and we're going to take a closer look at that one as well, probably related to WannaCry. I would just kind of skip down. The only other one to me that's interesting is 81 TCP, which has been on the chart for a while. Port 81 is typically, it's called the web alternate port. Mm-hmm. A lot of people use it as an administrative web interface port, things like that. And there's actually a family of internet cameras that have a vulnerability that listen on that port. So we're going to take a closer look at that one as well. So let's jump in. Here is the 23 TCP scanning activity. This is the number of sources scanning And this is a 3-year chart, so this shows you a lot of like history over the years of how the traffic shape has changed on this port. Most of the time, this is IoT embedded devices like we've talked about before that run some sort of Linux and have Telnet open, often with a default password. And these actors that have malware, they know a short list of all the passwords. They try them. If they get in, they take it over. But the interesting thing is way down here, like 3 years ago, it's about 50,000 scan sources per hour we're seeing. And it kind of kept going up back in 2015 into 2016. And then in, I guess, kind of the middle to maybe June timeframe of last year, it went gangbusters. So it went up to at a peak of maybe 450,000 scan sources per hour, which is a lot. That's a pretty significant botnet. The interesting thing to me is that this has kind of really creeped down here at the beginning of this year, and it's continued to creep down. I think we actually talked about it last year. We're like, wow, it's starting to go down. I wonder if it'll continue that trend. And it has. I don't really have a specific explanation for that other than maybe people are becoming more aware of this problem. Devices are being swapped out that do have this vulnerability. Manufacturers in general are getting a little bit better about not shipping devices with default passwords that are easy to guess. So that's gotten better. But we're down to, maybe 75,000 scan sources per hour, whereas we were back in 50,000 at the peak here. So that's a pretty big difference between 450,000 and 75,000. Still not where I want to be, but...
And we've seen, I think, some of the botnets that are supposed to be the good botnets that are actually supposed to be out there trying to fix the problems on port 23. So maybe that's having some effect on
That's
on
a
the
good
numbers
point.
too.
There are, Karna was one of them, and then there was another one called Reincarna. That was a good guy, so to speak, actor that was doing the same thing the malware does, but once they get on there, they try to lock the device down so nobody else can take it over. Maybe that's, factoring into the decline here. I don't know if I'm 100% in support of that behavior, but if this is the result, I'm not necessarily complaining. But
I'm sure if you went further back to 3 years, you'd probably have a larger spike where it went down and then went back and then started to go back up.
I don't think so. No. If we went back, and I could try, it's kind of hard to go really far back in our reporting here, but I bet you if we went back like 6 years, it would actually be like hardly anything. Like you would not see hardly anything.
The big spike in around June of last year, is that attributed to a specific event like a malware or something?
Yeah, it probably was, and I don't think it was. It might be Mirai. That sounds about right? It's like the May-June time frame, and then it trailed off towards the end of the year. But there's probably some other families, like Lizard Squad had their family of malware that was really big. They're using it for DDoS activities. It got pretty large. So there are a few actors that were really scooping up a lot of these devices during that time period. Now they're looking for different ports too. So we're going to talk about that with port 81 in a second.
Hopefully on the positive side, it may be that there's some cleanup that's actually happening today, and that's why we're not seeing so much of the scanning happening on port 23. The other side of it could be that it's shifting to something else.
So this one's kind of interesting. 445 TCP, this is the Microsoft basically file sharing SMB port. This is a 180-day chart. And for a long time, it's been pretty static in terms of how much scanning activity and the number of sources we see. So it's maybe around 10,000 scan sources per hour pretty consistently. I pulled up the Wikipedia page for WannaCry just to see if they actually had the kind of exact date or whatever the general consensus was. They actually have on their page May 12th to May 15th is about when the initial outbreak of WannaCry occurred. If you look here, that's right about when this big spike occurs in this chart here, roughly. We actually have maybe a little bit of an early indication in our data prior to May 12th. But at the time, I don't think we really had any kind of idea, what is this, It's kind of hard to read the tea leaves, but retrospectively, it gets a little bit easier. The other interesting thing is this has kind of continued to grow upwards in terms of the amount of devices scanning on it. So we know that there's a couple of family malware, using this, WannaCry being one of them. NotPetya, there's some rumors that it uses that as well. I don't think I've actually seen a sample of it. And I believe that there's some other actors out there using it as part of their stuff. This port, they're mostly targeting that family of exploits in the MS-17-010 category. Eternal Blue, Eternal Synergy, Eternal Romance.
Yep.
Eternal Blue is the one that WannaCry uses most, and that's why we're probably seeing most of this shape here. So interesting, something to keep an eye on. I didn't really know or have any expectations of how this might change, but now we're up around maybe 28,000 scan sources per hour at peak, where the normal baseline was down around about 10,000. So it's more than double, it's almost tripled in size from where it had been consistently for many years, pretty much. It's always been kind of around that.
We saw a graph that was showing a significant increase in the last couple of months of port 445 traffic, and that really right now doesn't look like it's in any position to slow down. So I mean, we're probably, based on the graph and what we're seeing, to current date today, we're probably, if we're predicting, it's probably going to hold for a little while longer at these higher levels for this because of this vulnerability that's still being actively exploited out there.
Right, and we do know, well, go ahead.
No, and I was just going to say that, as we all know today, all of this can sort of be mitigated by simply just pushing the patch that came out back in March.
Right, for the most part. Push the patch, run like the Microsoft malicious software removal tool, which does have detections for WannaCry.
Right.
Should remove it, unless it's a really exotic version of it, but most of it is not. And that should help. But there are definitely a lot of machines. I don't know why people do this, but people put machines out on the internet and then they don't patch them.
Right.
So they're sitting there not going to Windows to automatically update. Or maybe they have it set up to go to check Windows for update, but it doesn't automatically install. And unless a human intervenes, and that becomes a problem because some of these machines, I guess people set them up and they leave them there, especially if it's like a vendor appliance or something. So I would recommend to people that they take a look at their networks more closely and make sure that they have good patching policies, that they have good understanding of if there are devices on their network that are not patched, that they get patched.
Right.
So, last one I wanted to take a look at was the scan sources on port 81 TCP, and that's this HTTP alternate port for web. And this is most likely related, I haven't checked the recent activity, but I believe it probably is still related to a family of malware called Persirai, which is a Mirai-like variant. The name is actually a conjugation of Persian and Mirai stuck together, and that's how you get Persirai, because the command and controls for this particular malware use domains in the .ir for Iran. It was really pretty significantly large when it initially came out, around 50,000 or so scan sources. The command and controls were sinkholed. They since became reactivated and they've taken it over again. We can see the activity has kind of been out there where they're looking for more devices. This is actually exploiting a vulnerability in a family of IP camera that is out there. They're also, we've looked at a few of these bots that have this infection. They're scanning on 81, 82. I'm not sure what's on 82. They don't do that one as much for some reason. That might have been an accident, like a typo. Port 23, which is Telnet, which we talked about, and 7547, which actually has disappeared off the chart, but for a long time it was in the top 10 chart. 7547 is the CPE WAN management protocol. There we go, I got it.
Nice.
So it's used by DSL modems, home routers, usually by a service provider to manage that device. And Mirai also scans on that port as well. So anyway, it's come down quite a bit. I haven't taken a close look at this botnet malware family since it initially came out. Definitely looks like there's still some activity related to it.
Do we know what Persirai is trying to accomplish? Like, what's the goal of it? Is it DDoS or?
That's a good question. I don't know. I have not looked at the actual malware family. I do have a link to a write-up here that's actually a little bit dated now. It's back from April when it first came out. But the guys at 360 Network Security Research Lab put together a pretty good write-up of this family of malware, how it works, what it's trying to exploit. And I think they talk about, it might not be on this slide exactly, but I would recommend people go take a look at it if they're interested in this particular malware family, what family of IP cameras it's actually targeting. The overall intent, what they're actually trying to do, I don't know. I haven't really looked. You know, some of them do DDoS, some of them do click fraud. It's hard to say. We'd probably have to take a look. You'd have to look at it a lot more closely, you know,
Sure.
to find out what it is. We know Mirai was very heavily involved in DDoS behavior, but this is Perserai, so I don't know exactly what they're looking to do with the devices that they scoop up into it.
The Perserai scanning is interesting. Again, you know, we need to look into why they're scanning. What are they looking for? What are their purpose for doing the scanning? When they find a vulnerable device, what are they trying to do? Is this a criminal actor doing this? Is it a nation state actor doing this? So, like, there's a lot of questions that I think we need to try to answer, and I don't know that we are able to answer them.
And that's it really for the Internet Weather this week.
You always want to try to limit the services that you have available on the internet. If you're not using them, they should be turned off. You want to limit your exposure. You want to limit your surface area as to the best extent you can. You know, if you can limit the avenues where an attacker can get in, you're better protected.
Update and patch regularly. We've seen it time and time again that a lot of times you can avoid the pains that come along with, you know, these types of vulnerabilities now being exploited and then being introduced to the wild.